Are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. We will be discussing the present indicative tense in Spanish today. My name is Dan and my colleague Zach is here to answer any questions you may have throughout or at the end of the webinar, so please send any questions in at any time. The ways you can contact us are on the screen now, in case you weren't familiar with those. Okay, on the screen now you can see the area where you can send in questions if you do have those for us at any point throughout the webinar today. In today's webinar, we will discuss the use and the translations of the present indicative tense, along with how to conjugate verbs in this tense. Additionally, we will discuss the different verb forms and the sentence and question structure within the Spanish language. Okay, before getting into the present tense itself, let's begin with a discussion of verb types. And as you can see on the slide, there are a few different types that I'd like to discuss today. The first is the infinitive. Okay, the infinitive is the to form of the verb, and in Spanish you can identify that by recognizing the AR, ER, or IR ending on the end of the verb. And there's an example there for you. As you can see, decir ends in IR, and it means to say or to tell in English. Okay, then second we have the stem. The stem is the group of letters that precede the ending. So in that same example, the letters DEC would be considered the stem of that verb. And finally, and what we're going to focus on a lot today in today's webinar is a conjugation, which is formed by adding an ending to a stem, an ending other than the AR, ER, and IR, and that creates subject-verb agreement and a full verb form. So for instance, if we're using that example of decir in English, something like I say or you tell, those would be considered conjugations. And we will discuss how to do that in Spanish today as well. Okay, on this slide, one other thing that I'd like to point out as far as key verb terms would be the person and the number of a verb. The person identifies who is doing the action of the verb. You know, just like in English, you can have first person, second person, or third person. And its number, singular or plural, identifies or describes how many subjects are doing the action of the verb. So in all, you could have first person singular, first plural, second singular, usually not second plural, we can talk about that more later, and third person singular and third person plural. Okay, so on the slide here are the pronouns that represent subjects, both in English and in Spanish. The top, obviously in English, the bottom, the equivalents in Spanish. And these are very important words to be familiar with, as you'll use them quite often as you work through the Spanish course. They match up, from top left on the top chart to top left on the bottom chart, and so on and so forth. So for instance, a word like yo means I in Spanish as a subject pronoun, tú meaning you, and that's considered the familiar you, when you know somebody, when you're friends with them, related to them, etc. All right, third person on the singular side would always be considered the formal forms, and everything on the right side represents plural, we, they, etc. And as you can see on the note on the bottom of the page, a word like vosotros, the second plural that I mentioned just a minute ago on the previous slide, it does mean you in a plural context in a familiar way, but really just used in Spain and not something that you'll need to be familiar with for your program with Penn Foster. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please feel free to send those in at any time, and Zach would be happy to answer those for you. Okay, on this slide, we're going to start talking about how the present tense translates into English, and it has two possible translations. The first one is verb dependent, meaning, there's really not one clear, definitive way that a present tense verb will translate into English from Spanish. And you see some examples on the slide there. I run, I eat, I sleep. None of those really sound alike. They do look and sound quite different from one another. And secondly, the present tense could also translate like its counterpart, the present progressive tense, which means it must include a gerund, a present participle, which is a verb that ends in ing. As you can see there in the parentheses, I am running, I am eating, I am sleeping. And there will be more about the present progressive at a later time. Okay, so on slide 9, we're going to start talking about how to conjugate these verbs, but specifically a regular verb first and foremost. A regular verb in all tenses is the most common type of verb, and in the present tense there is a two-step process in order to form a conjugation. As I stated earlier, a conjugation is when a subject and verb are in agreement. So if you're trying to express something like I say or you read, these are the two steps that you're going to use for any verbs that might be considered regular in Spanish. So the two steps would begin with the first one there, as you see, the removal of the infinitive ending, AR, ER, or IR, leaving you with the stem of the verb. And step 2, quite simply, after you've removed one ending, you're going to then add a new ending, the present tense endings in this case, as you can see in the charts at the bottom of the slide. AR verbs do have their own set of endings, as you can see on the left side, starting with O, ending with on. And ER verbs have their own set of endings, starting with O and ending with N. The key difference here is in that first person plural, top right. For ER verbs, there are two possibilities. If it's an ER verb as an infinitive, the ending must be EMOS. If it is an IR verb, then the ending must be IMOS. And you will soon see some examples of each of those types. Okay, the reason why we have that blue there, that represents the vosotros, which is irrelevant to our Spanish program at Penn Foster, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so transitioning to slide 10 is where we have a few examples, one of each, an AR, an ER, and an IR verb. If you want to review those two steps of how to form a conjugation, a regular conjugation, just take a look at the verb above the box. You have an infinitive like hablar. First step would be to remove the AR, leaving you with the stem, which is HABL. And then that second step from the previous slide would be the attaching of those present tense AR endings, O, as, a, amos, and on. So you take the stem, HABL, take the ending for first singular O, and the word hablo is a conjugation, which means I speak or I talk in Spanish. And if you were to continue through that chart, staying on the left side first, hablas, you speak or you talk. Habla, he or she speaks or talks. Top right, hablamos, we speak. And bottom right, hablan, they, or all of you speak or talk. And the same would go for the other two verbs as you see there. Same two-step process, dropping the infinitive, adding the endings. Now, since comer and escribir are ER and IR verbs, they're going to take a different set of endings, the ones that were on the right side of the previous slide. And if you notice, top right of comer has that EMOS ending since it's an ER verb, as opposed to escribimos, which has the IMOS ending since its infinitive is an IR verb. Okay, so those are three examples of regular verbs. Like I said, there are many regular verbs in the Spanish language, but as we move forward here, we're going to start to focus on some irregular verbs. Okay, so in Spanish there are 5 groups or 5 types of irregular verbs, all categorized or labeled by letter, A through E. And the first thing to keep in mind about these is that not all of or none of their conjugations will have regular rules. Some do, as I'll try to explain as we go through each, but many do not follow the rules that we just discussed for the previous group, the regular verbs. So to begin, any irregular verb that is considered a group A is a verb that is only irregular in first person singular, in the yo form. As you can see on the slide, the rest of those conjugations for any of these verbs would be considered regular and therefore take the endings and the rules that we just discussed previously. We will show you some examples of these as we go on to the next couple slides. Any verb that's considered to be part of, there are some examples on the slide, my apologies, but we will show you their conjugations as we move forward. Any verb that is considered irregular B is one that is irregular in all persons, so the entire conjugation, the entire chart, will have irregularities and not follow regular rules whatsoever. Ir and ser being the 2 that we will discuss today. As we move on, any irregular verb that's considered group C has both an irregularity to it and some written accent marks. As you can see above the letter I, if you're not too familiar with what an accent mark is in Spanish, it's that little dash, little diagonal mark above a vowel. Not every vowel has them, but some do, and these conjugations will include some accent marks, as you'll see on the next couple slides. Group D is another one that does include accent marks, but it has more of a regular feel to it, regular endings, but verbs like enviar, graduar, and continuar will have accents on all persons, as you'll see later on either the I or the you. And so as I said, every person except for first person plural. So the nosotros form will just be regular without an accent mark. So again, quite unusual, quite irregular. And finally, any that are considered in group E are those verbs that end in EIR, like sonreír and reír, and they have quite unique conjugation rules, which will be shown in a few minutes. So we're going to expand upon each of those types, A through E, starting with slide 12, group A. On the slide you see 6 examples of verbs that are irregular in first person singular only. On the left would be the infinitive. On the right is its first person singular form, as you can tell above the chart. There is really no rhyme or reason to how to come up with these. These must be memorized. Right, even though a few of them do have similar letters, there really is no trend to follow there. So a verb like poner means to put, to place, or to set. So if you were trying to say something like, every night I set the table for dinner, a word like pongo would be required. Salir means to leave or to go out. Salgo, dar, to give. Doy, I give. Hacer is to do or to make. Hago, I do or I make. Traer, traigo, traer means to bring. So traigo means I bring. And caer means to fall. Therefore, caigo means I fall. Those are strictly the first person singular conjugations. After that, every other person would follow the regular rules. So if you think back to the ER verbs we talked about a few slides ago, a verb like poner would drop the ER, and second person would add ES, pones. Third singular would add an E, pone. First plural, ponemos, and third plural, ponen. All of the verbs in that group would follow suit. Irregular A, first person singular only. A is the first letter of the alphabet. That's a good clue to remember in this context. Moving on to slide 13, we have some verbs that are considered group B, irregular B. They are irregular in all persons. As you can tell, the verb ir does not have a V in its infinitive, but all of its conjugations begin with the letter V. All right, completely irregular and unusual. Voy, vas, va, vamos, and van. I go, you go, he or she goes, we go, and they go. And then ser, the verb to be, ser is used in more permanent contexts, like characteristics, etc. So if you ever hear somebody say soy, that means they're telling you something about themselves, that I am American, I am, very tall, so on and so forth. So again, quite an unusual conjugation there, completely irregular for the verb ser. And really, those are the only two that follow that trend. There's really not a whole lot of irregular B verbs. Irregular A would be the most common. Okay, we'll move on to the irregular or group C verbs. Again, they have some irregularities to them, as you can tell in words like estoy, oigo, oyes with the Y, oye, and oyen. But they also do have some accents, which makes them, part of this group. They don't have the same accent rules. As you can tell, estar has 3 accents, estás, está, and están. And oír only has 1 in first person plural, oímos. And estar, just to compare it to ser, estar also means to be, but it's used more in temporary contexts like location, feelings. So if you were to say that I am in Spain right now, you would use estoy. If you want to say we are tired, you would use estamos. And oír, as you can see there, means to hear. Again, not many verbs in this group. Very uncommon, but they do exist, and it's good to group them together. Our fourth irregular group, type D, they are the ones that have accents, as you can tell, in all persons on either the I on the left side, okay, or on the U on the right example, in every person except for nosotros, the top right, first plural. So they do take regular endings. Right? Notice how the 2 examples here are AR verbs, so they have the same endings, but the accent is applied, which makes it slightly irregular, since regular present tense verb endings do not include accent marks at all. Okay, so it's always an accent above the I or the U, depending on what is part of that verb stem. And VR has an I, accents above the I's, and graduar has a U, accents above the U. If you have any questions, please feel free to let us know. All right, transitioning to the last of the irregular groups, type E, those verbs that end in EIR. Again, not really a whole lot of a trend here to follow, mostly memorization. But if you do notice, sonreír and reír are very similar in terms of their conjugations. They have the same spellings, more or less, and the same accent rules. If you were to remove the S-O-N off of sonrío, you are left with río. And they are basically the same conjugations with just a few additional letters on the left side for the verb sonreír. And if you notice, there are accents in all persons in this group above each of the I's. Okay, so those are our 5 types of irregular verbs. As we move on to slide 17, we move to the next type of present tense verb. So far we've talked about regular verbs, we've talked about irregular verbs, and the third one now is called a stem changing or a boot verb. And as you see on the slide, it asks what is a stem change or a boot verb. It is a verb that has an irregular spelling based on the vowel in the stem, or a vowel in the stem, that occurs in every person but first person plural. It'll be much easier to see on the next couple of slides as we get into some examples here, but there are 4 types of present tense stem changes, as you see there. The vowel on the left is one that is within a verb stem. For instance, a verb we're going to see soon is a verb like pedir, P-E-D-I-R, which means to ask for or to request. In that context, since it's a stem changing verb, the E changes to the letter I in the boot, which means in first person singular, second singular, and third plural. It does not stem change in first person plural in the top right, as you will see as we move forward. So here's an example of an E to I stem change. Notice the second letter of all the ones in yellow is now an I. because this is an E to I type, E to I stem change, it occurs within that boot, as you can tell from the funny illustration on the slide. First person plural does not get included in that. It is merely a regular conjugation where you simply drop the IR and add the IMOS that we talked about earlier within regular verbs. So E to I would be the first of 4 types. There are quite a few of E to I stem changes that you'll come across in your program, pay dear being our example here. As we move on to the second type of present tense stem change, we have E to IE stem changing verbs. The verb pensar, which means to think. Again, you notice there's that IE combination within the boot in the yellow parts of the chart, but you can tell that the I is missing from first person plural since it does not include the stem change. It is simply regular. And now it has an AMOS ending because this is an AR verb, different from the previous. Again, there are many others, but this is our example for the time being. You'll come across more as you get into your Spanish course. Dormir is an example of an O to UE stem change, our third of 4 types. Yet again, you'll see within the yellow parts of the chart, the O has changed to UE. Regular endings still do apply. And first person plural dormimos is excluded from that stem change. It does not undergo the stem change per the rules of this group. Okay, and there are other examples as well. This is our key one for the moment. And on slide 21, you'll see the last of the 4 present tense stem changes, U to UE, the verb jugar, which means to play a game or a sport. Notice the UE is present within the boot in the yellow again, and the E is excluded from first person plural. Okay, and this is probably the least common of the stem change types in the present tense. Not too many verbs have a U in their stem. Not too many verbs have the U to UE stem change. The other 3 are much more common. Okay, as we transition out of stem changing verbs, on slide 22, we will talk about our final type or group of present tense verbs. This group has both an irregular component and a stem change. All right, and there are a few different ones that we'll talk about here, as you can tell from the number 1 on the slide. So in this case, a verb like venir is irregular in first singular, highlighted in green. It does not have that IE stem change, but we have a slightly shorter boot. Second person singular, third person singular, and third person plural are within the boot, and they do undergo that E to IE stem change where the I has been brought in. Regular endings still apply to all of these, and first person plural is again regular and excluded from the stem change and the irregularity. So quite a few things going on with this type of verb. Again, not very common, but there are a few that do exist, so it's always good to be familiar with those. Okay, and then on this slide, here's the second example. Right, much like venir, very similar conjugation. This verb means to have in terms of possession. It's also the verb that is used with age in Spanish. If you were to tell somebody your specific age, this is the verb to use. It still has that E to IE stem change. Looks and sounds very similar within the boot. The biggest difference as far as this conjugation to the previous one would be tenemos has an EMOS ending, as it is an ER verb, and venimos on the previous slide had an IMOS ending since it was an IR verb. But again, if you were to compare the two, vengo, tengo, vienes, tienes, etc., very similar conjugations, very similar sounds. Okay, not very common, right? Not too many, like I said, but they do exist. And our last example of an irregular verb with a stem change would be the verb decir that we mentioned earlier in the webinar, a verb that means to say or to tell. There is that E to I stem change within the boot, but one difference is, as you can tell in first person singular, to say, or I tell, there is a G there. Again, no rhyme or reason, just something that has to be memorized and applied. The C, however, remains in all the other forms, all the other persons, with the stem change still occurring inside the boot and no stem change occurring in first person plural. Just a regular conjugation decimos to say we say or we tell. And to wrap up our webinar, the last thing we wanted to talk about are just some reminders. First being how to structure a Spanish statement, a sentence more or less, versus how to structure or set up a Spanish question. And this will come up quite a lot in your program with us. Okay, you'll have to write out a lot of your own sentences and questions. Therefore, this is a key rule to be mindful of. The biggest difference is in regards to the subject of the sentence, who is performing the action of the verb. In a statement, a sentence, the subject comes first, the word yo in the first example, before the verb. Okay, but however, in a question, that's simply reversed, and you actually have two options. All right, the subject here, usted, which means you, can go after the verb. All right, the question is asking, do you have a brother? It can go after the verb, or if you prefer, it can also go at the very end of the question. Either one is acceptable. That's why the usted is in parentheses. You don't need to write it twice. It's just your choice. More commonly, you'll see it right after the verb, but it's not wrong if it is at the end. And our final two reminders just have to do with the translations of the present tense. All right, that it can translate as itself, quote unquote, verb dependent. I run, you eat, we sleep. None of them sound alike. They all have unique sounds and spellings. But the present tense can also translate progressively, meaning with a gerund or a present participle, which is a verb that ends in ing. I am running, you are sleeping, he is eating, etc. And then finally, just to review the stem changing group, the boot verbs. As we talked about, there were 4 types of them in the present tense. They are irregular. They undergo the stem change in all persons except first plural. We saw quite a bit of that today as we went through our webinar in a lot of Spanish present tense verbs. So that concludes today's webinar. We do thank you for your attention. If you have any questions at this time, you may send them in to us, and Zach would be happy to answer them for you. If you do need any help in your course, feel free to contact us in any way that you see on the screen here. We are always willing and available to help you progress throughout your Spanish course. Thank you for your attention. Have a great day.